Fear in the Annabelle case was never theatrical. It did not announce itself through panic or hysteria. It emerged quietly among those who understood the patterns well enough to recognize what they implied. Investigators who encountered Annabelle did not describe terror in the conventional sense. They described reluctance, hesitation, a persistent awareness that some boundaries, once identified, should not be tested again. This is what distinguishes fear rooted in imagination from fear rooted in experience. The latter does not seek validation, it seeks distance. What makes this case unique is not the severity of individual incidents, but the cumulative weight of restraint that followed them. Investigators who had encountered dozens of reported anomalies found themselves unusually conservative around Annabelle. Procedures were tightened, exposure was limited, language became more clinical. Humor disappeared. These changes did not occur because something dramatic happened in a single moment. They occurred because repeated patterns left no room for curiosity without consequence. The case taught caution through repetition rather than shock. Those involved learned early that Annabelle did not reward investigation. Attempts to understand her through increased engagement produced diminishing returns. Each new interaction added complexity without clarity. The more data collected, the less controllable the environment became. This paradox forced a shift in methodology. Traditional investigation seeks answers by increasing access. The Annabelle case inverted this logic. Reduced access produced stability. Increased access produced volatility. Over time, this inversion became impossible to ignore. Investigators documented a consistent emotional response among those with prolonged exposure. A desire to disengage. This was not avoidance born of fear, but recognition born of pattern recognition. Individuals who initially approached the case with curiosity eventually reached the same conclusion independently. They stopped asking questions. They limited discussion. They followed protocol without debate. This convergence mattered. It suggested that understanding did not lead to confidence. It led to restraint. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is how little effort the phenomenon appeared to require. There was no need for escalation, no need for dramatic displays. Influence persisted through ordinary human tendencies: curiosity, doubt, familiarity. These tendencies are reliable. They do not need to be forced. Investigators realized that the system sustained itself through predictable behavior. This realization reframed fear entirely. The danger was not that something powerful existed. The danger was that something patient existed. Patience altered how risk was perceived. A threat that acts immediately can be confronted. A threat that waits must be managed indefinitely. Annabelle belonged to the second category. Investigators understood that waiting was not a limitation for the phenomenon. It was an advantage. Time eroded vigilance. Time normalized presence. Time encouraged reinterpretation. The longer nothing dramatic happened, the easier it became to question whether caution was still necessary. This cycle repeated often enough to become a documented risk factor. What investigators feared was not a sudden outbreak of activity, but gradual erosion of discipline. Discipline depended on memory. Memory depended on documentation. Documentation depended on accuracy without dramatization. Each link in this chain had to remain intact. If memory faded, procedures weakened. If procedures weakened, engagement increased. Engagement altered conditions. This causal loop defined the long-term risk of the case. Fear, in this context, was not emotional. It was procedural. Another reason investigators continued to fear the case lies in its resistance to categorization. Annabelle did not fit neatly into existing models. She was not a poltergeist phenomenon driven by chaos. She was not a possession narrative defined by overt control. She functioned through influence rather than force. Influence is harder to measure, harder to prove, harder to neutralize. Investigators are trained to respond to threats they can identify clearly. Annabelle resisted clarity. This resistance forced humility. Humility, in turn, bred caution. The case also challenged assumptions about safety thresholds. Most investigations rely on escalation to justify intervention. Annabelle rarely escalated beyond tolerable limits. Effects were disruptive but not catastrophic. This restraint prevented decisive action while sustaining risk. Investigators recognized this as a form of self-regulation. The phenomenon operated just below the level that would trigger irreversible response. This positioning allowed it to persist indefinitely. The absence of crisis became its greatest protection. Those who encountered Annabelle repeatedly described a shared instinct, not to push further. This instinct did not arise from instruction. It emerged organically. Even skeptics reported a growing reluctance to engage. This reluctance was not fear in the cinematic sense. It was recognition of imbalance. Something felt asymmetrical. Interaction cost more than it returned. The system favored the phenomenon, not the investigator. Continuing felt imprudent. Fear, in this case, became synonymous with respect for limits. Investigators did not fear Annabelle because they believed she would suddenly attack. They feared her because they understood how easily conditions could shift if discipline failed. They feared complacency more than aggression. They feared curiosity more than hostility. This inversion of fear is difficult to communicate, but it is central to why the case remains unsettling to those who know it well. The enduring fear surrounding Annabelle is not rooted in mystery. It is rooted in familiarity. Familiarity with patterns that do not resolve. Familiarity with systems that require constant management. Familiarity with the knowledge that some phenomena do not end. They persist quietly, relying on ordinary behavior to sustain them. Investigators fear Annabelle because she represents a problem without a solution, only maintenance. This first part establishes the foundation for understanding why the case still commands caution decades later. The fear is not dramatic, but it is precise. It does not demand attention, it discourages it, and in that discouragement lies the clearest indication that those who encountered Annabelle understood something fundamental. Some risks are best respected by distance, not confronted by curiosity. As investigators spent more time around the Annabelle case, fear began to take on a distinctly professional form. It was no longer an emotional reaction, but a structured response shaped by precedent. Every protocol, every limitation, every restriction existed because something had already gone wrong at least once. This is the nature of experienced caution. It does not speculate, it remembers. Those who feared Annabelle did so not because of what they imagined might happen, but because of what had already demonstrated a pattern. Patterns, once recognized, carry authority. One of the earliest indicators that this case was different lay in how consistently it resisted investigative momentum. Most cases invite escalation. More questions lead to clearer answers. Annabelle did the opposite. The deeper investigators attempted to go, the less stable conditions became. Clarity decreased as engagement increased. This inversion unsettled those involved because it undermined the basic assumption that knowledge produces control. In this case, knowledge carried cost. Each attempt to extract meaning altered the environment in subtle but measurable ways. Investigators learned to stop before reaching that threshold. The fear that developed was therefore anticipatory rather than reactive. It was rooted in foresight. Those managing the case could see how easily curiosity could reintroduce instability. They had witnessed cycles repeat: engagement, disturbance, withdrawal, stabilization. Each cycle reinforced the same lesson. The system was not fragile, but it was sensitive. Small changes produced outsized effects. This sensitivity demanded restraint. Fear, in this context, functioned as an internal signal to maintain limits rather than challenge them. Another reason investigators continued to fear the case was its independence from belief. Many phenomena diminish when skepticism increases. Annabelle did not. Skeptics experienced effects comparable to believers. Dismissal did not neutralize risk. In some cases, it amplified it by encouraging prolonged exposure. This removed a common safeguard. Normally, disbelief offers psychological distance. Here, distance had to be intentional. Without it, skepticism became another form of engagement. This realization forced investigators to adopt behavioral controls rather than relying on mindset alone. The absence of dramatic escalation also contributed to sustained fear. Without a crisis, there was no opportunity for closure. Cases that culminate in a definitive event eventually end. Annabelle offered no such endpoint. It lingered below crisis thresholds, remaining perpetually relevant. Investigators recognized that waiting for escalation was not a strategy. Escalation might never arrive. Meanwhile, complacency could. This imbalance made the case uniquely exhausting. It demanded constant awareness without providing resolution. Over time, investigators noticed a subtle psychological effect unique to this case: decision fatigue. Managing boundaries indefinitely without reinforcement wears down discipline. Each day without incident slightly weakened the urgency of caution. This gradual erosion posed a greater threat than any overt activity. Fear shifted toward this erosion. Investigators feared forgetting more than confrontation. They feared normalization more than attack. This fear drove the development of rigid procedures designed to counter human tendencies rather than external threats. The case also revealed an uncomfortable truth about authority. Not all warnings carry equal weight. Verbal cautions fade quickly. Written protocols endure longer, but even they lose impact over time. Investigators learned that fear must be institutionalized to remain effective. It could not rely on personal conviction alone. Procedures had to exist independently of belief. Compliance had to be mandatory, not optional. This institutional fear, embedded in routine rather than emotion, was one of the most significant outcomes of the case. Another factor sustaining fear was unpredictability of consequence. Effects were consistent in pattern, but inconsistent in manifestation. The same action did not always produce the same outcome. This variability prevented confidence. Investigators could not test boundaries safely. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes something did. The inability to predict which outcome would occur reinforced caution. When risk cannot be reliably quantified, conservative behavior becomes rational. Annabelle remained feared because she resisted risk calculation. Investigators also noted that fear intensified among those who understood the case most thoroughly. Partial knowledge invited curiosity. Full knowledge invited restraint. This gradient mattered. It suggested that fear was not born of ignorance, but of comprehension. The more clearly the system was understood, the less appealing engagement became. This stands in contrast to popular narratives where understanding empowers action. In the Annabelle case, understanding limited it. The persistence of fear decades later reflects the durability of these lessons. New cases fade as memories fade. Annabelle did not. Her case remained a reference precisely because it never resolved. Investigators could point to it as an example of what happens when restraint is ignored and why some situations demand long-term management rather than intervention. Fear endured, not as panic, but as institutional memory. This fear also extended beyond the object itself. Annabelle became symbolic of a broader category of risk, phenomena that operate through interaction rather than force. Investigators learned to recognize similar patterns elsewhere and applied the same caution. In this way, fear became transferable. It informed practice beyond a single case. Annabelle was feared not only for what she represented, but for what she taught. The second part of this story reveals that fear, when stripped of dramatization, becomes a tool. It guides behavior. It enforces boundaries. It preserves stability. Investigators still fear Annabelle because that fear works. It prevents mistakes. It discourages experimentation. It sustains distance. In a case defined by endurance rather than escalation, fear was not a weakness. It was a strategy. This understanding sets the stage for the next phase, where fear evolves into legacy. The question is no longer why investigators feared Annabelle, but how that fear was preserved, transferred, and institutionalized over time, and why losing it would be the most dangerous outcome of all. As the Annabelle case moved from active management into long-term stewardship, fear transformed again, this time into legacy. Investigators understood that personal caution would not be enough to sustain containment across years and generations. Individuals leave. Memories fade. What remains are systems. The challenge became how to encode restraint into procedure so that it would survive turnover without becoming ritual devoid of meaning. This was not an abstract concern. The case had already shown that normalization erodes discipline faster than any external force. The only defense against normalization was institutional memory. Institutional memory required translation. Early investigators had lived the patterns firsthand. They had felt the subtle shifts, recognized the correlations, and learned the costs of engagement through experience. Those who followed would not have that advantage. For them, the case would exist primarily as documentation. Documentation lacks immediacy. Without care, it can become inert. Investigators therefore refined how the case was recorded. Language remained precise and unemotional. Chronology was emphasized over narrative. Conclusions were stated conservatively. This style was intentional. It discouraged fascination while preserving clarity. The goal was not to persuade, it was to instruct. One of the most effective mechanisms for preserving fear was consistency. Procedures were designed to be simple, repeatable, and non-negotiable. Complexity invites interpretation. Interpretation invites deviation. Deviation introduces risk. By minimizing discretion, investigators reduced opportunities for curiosity-driven engagement. This approach reflected a hard-earned lesson. Fear that depends on individual judgment is unreliable. Fear embedded in routine is durable. Compliance did not require belief. It required adherence. The case also highlighted the importance of boundaries between roles. Not everyone needed the same level of access or information. Investigators learned that broad exposure increased risk without increasing safety. Information was therefore compartmentalized. Those responsible for physical containment received procedural guidance without speculative detail. Those responsible for documentation received context without encouragement to explore. This segmentation reduced fixation and limited the spread of curiosity. The case became less a story and more a set of responsibilities. Over time, investigators observed that fear diminished most rapidly in environments where procedures were followed mechanically rather than thoughtfully. Mechanical compliance produced short-term stability, but long-term vulnerability. When people follow rules without understanding their purpose, they are more likely to abandon them under pressure or reinterpret them when circumstances change. To counter this, training emphasized rationale alongside instruction. Individuals were taught not only what to do, but why deviation mattered. Understanding reinforced fear in its most functional form, respect for limits. Another critical factor in preserving fear was acknowledging uncertainty openly. Investigators resisted the temptation to claim mastery over the case. Claims of control breed confidence. Confidence invites testing. Instead, documentation emphasized unknowns, what could not be predicted, what could not be measured reliably. This humility preserved caution. It communicated that the system remained sensitive to change and that outcomes could not be guaranteed. Fear rooted in humility proved more resilient than fear rooted in authority. As years passed, the Annabelle case became a reference used to train judgment rather than provoke alarm. It was cited not as an extreme anomaly, but as an example of how subtle systems persist. New investigators encountered it alongside other cases that demonstrated similar patterns of influence. This comparative framing reduced sensationalism while preserving seriousness. Annabelle was feared not because she was unique, but because she was instructive. She illustrated how quickly stability could unravel when engagement increased. The broader implication of this phase was that fear, when properly cultivated, becomes transferable knowledge. It informs decisions beyond a single case. Investigators began applying the same principles: limited engagement, procedural restraint, controlled exposure, to other reports with comparable profiles. In this way, fear evolved into methodology. It shaped practice without requiring constant reference to the original events. Annabelle's influence extended indirectly through the lessons she imposed. This evolution also revealed a paradox. The better the system worked, the less visible the risk became. Success made fear harder to justify. When nothing happened, it was tempting to assume nothing would. Investigators countered this by documenting near misses and subtle deviations, not to alarm, but to remind. These records preserved a sense of consequence without dramatization. They reinforced the understanding that stability was an achievement, not a default state. The role of leadership became particularly important during this phase. Leaders set tone. If leaders treated the case casually, others followed. If leaders demonstrated restraint, caution persisted. Fear proved contagious in both directions. Investigators therefore selected leaders based not on boldness, but on consistency. The ability to maintain discipline without escalation became a valued trait. This selection criterion reflected the case's core lesson. Effectiveness lies in restraint, not confrontation. As the case aged, public narratives continued to diverge from documented reality. This divergence created external pressure. New personnel encountered sensational portrayals that conflicted with procedural framing. Investigators addressed this by explicitly separating fiction from practice. Films were acknowledged as interpretations, not references. Documentation remained the sole authority. This separation protected fear from dilution by entertainment. It reinforced that what mattered was not what people believed about Annabelle, but how they behaved around the case. The third phase concludes with a recognition that fear, in its most useful form, is not emotional intensity, but sustained discipline. Investigators still feared Annabelle because that fear had been refined, structured, and preserved deliberately. It no longer depended on shock or mystery. It depended on memory, procedure, and humility. Losing that fear would not produce immediate disaster. It would produce gradual erosion. And erosion, as the case had demonstrated repeatedly, was the most reliable path to instability. This sets the final stage. The question is no longer why investigators fear Annabelle, or how that fear is preserved, but what happens when fear fades despite best efforts, and why the case demands vigilance even in the absence of visible threat. The final reason investigators still fear the Annabelle case lies not in what has happened, but in what could happen if vigilance fails. This fear is quiet, structural, and forward-looking. By the time the case reached this phase, there was no illusion that danger would announce itself again dramatically. The real concern was far more subtle, that nothing would happen at all. Silence, in this context, was not reassurance. It was risk. Silence allowed routines to harden into habit, habit into assumption, and assumption into neglect. Investigators understood that the most dangerous moment in any long-term case is when it begins to feel finished. This realization reframed the concept of threat entirely. Annabelle no longer represented an active anomaly requiring response. She represented a system that remained stable only as long as specific conditions were maintained. Remove attention, and influence diminished. Remove boundaries, and influence returned. The danger was not dormant power waiting to explode. It was a latent mechanism waiting to be reactivated through ordinary behavior. This made fear less about anticipation of catastrophe and more about prevention of drift. Investigators identified drift as the primary failure mode. Drift did not occur suddenly. It emerged through small compromises, a warning not reiterated, a procedure shortened, a discussion extended longer than necessary. Each compromise felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they altered conditions. The case had demonstrated repeatedly that conditions mattered more than intent. Good intentions did not prevent consequences. Only consistent behavior did. This understanding fueled a persistent unease among those responsible for stewardship. They were not guarding against an enemy. They were guarding against erosion. Another source of fear was the impossibility of verification. There was no definitive test to confirm safety. The absence of incidents could mean effective containment, or it could mean preparation. Investigators had no way to distinguish between the two conclusively. This ambiguity demanded conservative assumptions. In risk assessment, uncertainty increases required caution. The Annabelle case existed permanently in this uncertain space. Fear, therefore, was rational. It compensated for the lack of measurable assurance. The generational aspect of the case intensified this fear. Each new generation of caretakers inherited responsibility without first-hand experience of escalation. For them, the danger was abstract, mediated through documentation and instruction. Investigators worried not about malice, but about reinterpretation. New eyes bring new assumptions. New assumptions invite new tests. The case required each generation to accept restraint without demanding proof. This demand ran counter to human nature. Humans trust what they see. Annabelle demanded trust in what had already been seen by others. This tension produced one of the most sobering conclusions of the entire case. Fear must sometimes exist without immediate justification. Waiting for justification could itself create risk. Investigators learned that the safest moment to respect boundaries is before they feel necessary. Once necessity is felt, conditions may already have shifted. This lesson applied not only to Annabelle, but to any system where influence operates quietly. Fear, in this sense, was preemptive. It protected against delayed realization. The persistence of fear also reflected recognition of asymmetry. The phenomenon associated with Annabelle required minimal effort to persist. Humans required constant effort to contain it. This imbalance favored endurance over control. The system did not tire. People did. Investigators feared fatigue more than aggression. Fatigue led to shortcuts. Shortcuts altered conditions. Altered conditions invited response. This asymmetry meant that long-term success depended less on strength and more on consistency. Consistency is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Acknowledging this difficulty was itself a source of fear. Public fascination with Annabelle further complicated this balance. External attention created indirect engagement even when physical boundaries held. Discussion, speculation, and reinterpretation circulated widely, beyond the control of investigators. While this attention did not directly breach containment, it increased the likelihood of future misunderstanding. Someone, somewhere, would encounter the case stripped of context and approach it incorrectly. Investigators feared not the present state, but the inevitability of future missteps. Time guaranteed turnover. Turnover guaranteed error. The case demanded preparation for mistakes that had not yet occurred. This awareness transformed fear into something almost administrative. It informed planning, training, and documentation. It shaped how information was archived and how access was granted. It dictated tone. Fear became embedded in process rather than emotion. Those who worked with the case were not anxious. They were careful. Carefulness replaced alarm as the dominant posture. This posture endured precisely because it was unspectacular. It did not depend on constant reinforcement through crisis. The Annabelle case ultimately stands as a reminder that not all dangers announce themselves, and not all safety can be confirmed. Investigators still fear the case because it refuses to end. It does not provide closure, victory, or proof of defeat. It offers only maintenance. Maintenance requires humility, patience, and acceptance of limits. These qualities are harder to sustain than courage. Courage thrives in moments. Maintenance demands years. This is why the case still commands respect. Not because it promises future horror, but because it demonstrates how easily stability can be lost through neglect. The fear is not of Annabelle acting, but of people forgetting. Forgetting why boundaries were set. Forgetting what patterns revealed. Forgetting that absence of incident is not absence of risk. In this sense, fear functions as memory's guardian. The final lesson of the Annabelle case is therefore quiet and uncomfortable. Some threats do not need to be defeated. They need to be remembered. Remembered accurately. Remembered without embellishment. Remembered long enough that boundaries remain meaningful. Investigators still fear Annabelle because fear preserves that memory. Without it, the case would become just another story. And stories invite curiosity. Curiosity invites engagement. Engagement alters conditions. The cycle would begin again. This is not a warning about a doll. It is a warning about systems that persist quietly, relying on ordinary human behavior to sustain them. Annabelle endures not because she is powerful, but because she is patient. And patience, when met with forgetfulness, has always been enough.